Odin approached Yggdrasil with the swagger of a god who'd never lost a wager. The All-Father, they called him, but that was aspirational branding. He was still the Wanderer, the Riddler, the one who won through cleverness rather than strength. Thor had the muscle, Odin had the angles, and he'd found the ultimate angle. The tree rose before him, vast beyond measure, its roots drinking from wells of memory and fate, while its branches held the architecture of reality. 9 realms threaded through its structure, like beads on cosmic string. Odin had walked them all, knew their boundaries, understood their rules. He'd spent centuries mapping the edges of existence. Now he would exploit a loophole. Self to self, he murmured, running his fingers along Gungnir's shaft. The spear hummed with potential, eager. It had tasted divine blood before, had drunk deep when Odin felled Ymir and carved the giant's corpse into continents. What his followers didn't know, what even the other gods had forgotten, was that Yggdrasil wasn't just any world tree. It was Ymir's spine, still growing, still aware in whatever way dead gods remained aware. The trick was elegant in its simplicity. Sacrifice requires recipient and offering to be distinct. But what if they weren't? What if you could be both giver and receiver, priest and victim, killer and killed? The paradox should be impossible. The universe should reject it. That rejection was exactly what Odin was counting on. When you tried to divide 0 by 0, when you forced reality to compute the impossible, sometimes the math broke open and showed you what lay beneath the equations, the spaces between states, the gaps in cosmic code. Odin tied the noose around his own neck, fashioned from his own hair, knotted with his own hands. He was grinning. This was what he lived for. The moment before the con paid off, when you'd done all the setup and just needed to commit to the bit. He positioned Gungnir against his ribs, angled precisely to pierce without killing immediately. 9 days and 9 nights, the Völva had prophesied. He'd need to stay conscious, stay aware, ride the edge between living and dying while the trick worked its magic. The spear's point pressed against skin. Odin took a breath, savoring the last moment of being merely clever. Then he drove the weapon home. The strike. The first thing Odin understood was that he'd miscalculated. Not wrong, the trick was working, but he'd thought of it as metaphor, as spiritual concept, as poetic truth. 9 realms, 9 perspectives. The wisdom that comes from seeing reality from every angle at once. It wasn't metaphor. Gungnir didn't just pierce his flesh in Midgard. The spear existed in all 9 realms simultaneously, because of course it did. He'd made it that way, forged from the same cosmic materials as the tree itself. And when it struck everywhere. In Asgard, Odin hung from the highest branch, watching his hall Valhalla shimmer in golden light while his body went rigid with impact. In Midgard, the humans' realm, he dangled above their petty wars, blood dripping onto soil that would later be called sacred. In Jotunheim, the giants jeered at a god made vulnerable, and his giant self felt the weapon enter from a completely different vector. In Niflheim, he was drowning and impaled simultaneously. In Muspelheim, burning and pierced. In Alfheim, the Light Elves' realm, his luminous body flickered as the spear entered. In Svartalfheim, his shadow self felt the wound as absence rather than presence. In Vanaheim, his reflection in their pools showed 9 Odins stacked atop each other, all bleeding from the same impossible wound. In Helheim, he was already dead and dying again, the spear striking a corpse that could still feel. 1 wound, 9 locations. Single consciousness threaded through all of them like the spear itself. The pain was architectural. Not 9 separate agonies, but one pain existing in 9 different frequencies, harmonizing into something beyond sensation. Odin tried to scream and discovered he had 9 mouths that wouldn't coordinate. 9 sets of lungs pulling breath in 9 different atmospheric pressures. Time fractured. In Niflheim, he'd been hanging for hours. In Muspelheim, seconds. In Midgard, the sun hadn't moved. His consciousness tried to reconcile the temporal dissonance and failed, stretching like taffy across incompatible chronologies. This was the trick's true cost, he realized with rising horror. Not death, not even pain, but experiencing existence from every possible angle meant losing the singular perspective that made him him. How could you maintain identity when you were simultaneously burning and freezing, dying fast and dying slow, hanging in golden light and utter darkness? The noose tightened, or maybe it loosened, or maybe it did both, depending on which realm you measured from. Odin felt his sense of self beginning to fork, to split into 9 contradictory narratives. and understood with crystal clarity that he'd invented a torture the gods hadn't even imagined. The spear kept him connected, kept him one despite being 9, and that unity was agony beyond naming. The wound web. By the second day or second hour or second week, time had lost consensus. Odin discovered he could navigate the wound. The spear wasn't just connecting him to himself, it was connecting him to the tree. Gungnir had pierced Yggdrasil as thoroughly as it had pierced Odin, and the tree, dead Ymir's transformed spine, god corpse wearing bark, had a memory system all its own. Sap ran through channels carved over eons, carrying information from root to branch, realm to realm. The tree had been watching, recording, knowing, since before the 9 worlds stabilized into their current forms. When Odin's blood mixed with that sap, he gained access. It was like reading 9 books simultaneously, while each book rewrote itself based on the others. The roots in Niflheim whispered of things that had tried to gnaw through from outside. The branches in Asgard hummed with the weight of divine footsteps. The trunk in Midgard bore scars from human axes, each cut a small death that the tree barely noticed. Through the wound web, Odin could feel other things impaled on reality's structure, concepts made physical. Lif and Lifthrasir, the 2 humans who would survive Ragnarök, were already there somehow, seeds waiting in the wood. The Norn's threads tangled through the branches like spider silk, fate made fibrous. And something else, something vast and patient pressed against the bark from outside. Odin tried to focus, but his consciousness kept sliding between realms. In Jotunheim, frost formed on his beard. In Muspelheim, his beard had already burned away. In Midgard, he was somewhere between the two, ice and ember mixing in his lungs. The tree spoke in Sap's slow pulses. You wanted to see. Then see, but seeing costs. Everything costs, even gods pay the toll. Odin's sight, his singular, focused, clever sight, began fragmenting into compound vision. Like an insect's eye, each realm providing one facet of a larger image he couldn't quite process. He saw Midgard from above and below simultaneously, watched himself hanging from inside the tree and outside it at once, observed his own death from 9 perspectives, while still being alive enough to observe. The wound wept, not just blood but something else, potential maybe, or certainty. The fluid that ran down the spear's shaft carried away his confidence, his cleverness, his trickster's assumption that he could outsmart consequences. In its place, the tree poured knowledge. Not wisdom. Wisdom implied understanding. This was raw information, pattern recognition beyond language, the brutal awareness of how things actually worked beneath the stories gods told themselves. Through the wound web, Odin felt the other 8 versions of himself reaching similar realizations, and the synchronization was nauseating. 9 perspectives collapsing towards singular understanding. 9 deaths teaching one lesson. The tree was a corpse. He was nailed to a corpse, and something outside was waiting for them both to finish dying, so it could have its turn. The bleaching. On the 3rd day, Odin noticed his left hand looked wrong, not injured. The spear wound was central, precise, calculating, but his hand, hanging limp from the noose, had lost something essential. The color seemed faded, like fabric left too long in sun. He tried to flex his fingers and felt the movement echo strangely, as if someone else was flexing in mirror image. By the 4th day, the effect had spread to his arm. The deep tan of a god who'd walked under 9 different suns was leaching out, leaving something pale and bloodless. Not death pale. He'd seen plenty of corpses, and this wasn't that. This was absence pale, as if pigment itself was being drawn away. Through the wound web, he felt it happening in all 9 realms at once. 9 Odins draining simultaneously, color pulling out like water from a squeezed cloth. His red-gold beard turning ash-white, his sun-weathered face becoming marble pale. Even his remaining eye losing its blue-gray depth, fading towards something colorless. And his hair, gods, his hair. It had been dark as storm clouds, threaded with gray earned from centuries of scheming. Now it bleached from roots to tips like reverse time-lapse, going white as bone, white as winter, white as the absence of all warmth. But the color wasn't disappearing, it was moving. In the space between realms, in the quantum foam where Gungnir threaded through 9 realities at once, something was coalescing, gaining definition, drawing substance from Odin's draining palette, like an artist stealing pigment from one canvas to paint another. Odin felt it the way you feel someone watching from behind, a presence assembling itself from pieces of his own identity. The parts of himself that laughed at inappropriate moments, the impulses he'd learned to suppress when he'd claimed the title of All-Father, the joy of chaos for its own sake, the delight in watching careful plans collapse into beautiful disaster. The Trickster. He was bleeding out his trickster nature, and it was becoming something separate. Someone separate. Through 9 pairs of failing eyes, Odin saw the figure taking shape in the sap-blood mixture running down the tree. Flame-red hair where Odin's had gone white, green eyes bright with mischief where Odin's had faded, skin like new copper while Odin's turned to tarnished silver. The being wore Odin's grin, the one he hadn't smiled since driving the spear home, the one he would never smile again. "Brother?" the figure said, though it had no mouth yet to speak with. The word came through the wound web, through the blood bond being forged in real time. "Brother, what have you done to us?" Odin tried to answer and couldn't. All 9 versions of him tried simultaneously, but the responses contradicted each other, cancelling into silence. He'd lost the ability to speak with one voice. The colourful figure laughed with Odin's old laughter, and reached up through the sap to touch the spear. "I'll be your shadow," it said. "Your jest, your chaos. Everything you're sacrificing to bear what comes next." The hand closed around Gungnir's shaft. Blood brothers then, born in the wound, bound by the trick that split us. Odin felt the connection solidify, felt Loki become real through the severance of what Odin had been. The equation balanced through division, and still the color drained, still the bleaching continued, until Odin hung white as winter itself while Loki blazed with stolen vitality below. The brother emerges. Loki pulled himself free from the tree's bark, like a butterfly tearing through a chrysalis, except the butterfly was laughing and the chrysalis was screaming in 9 different directions. He was beautiful in the way fire is beautiful, dangerous, unpredictable, impossible to grasp. Where Odin had become monochrome, Loki arrived in full spectrum. His eyes shifted between colors as if unable to settle on just one. His hair moved like flame even in still air. His smile was Odin's smile, but younger, unmarred by the weight of foresight. "Gods," Loki breathed, looking at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. Which Odin supposed he was. "Gods, you actually did it. Split yourself in half just to cheat the rules." He looked up at the hanging figure, at the 9 Odins suspended in their individual agonies, and his expression flickered between pity and admiration. "That's brilliant, that's insane. That's so perfectly you that you had to stop being you to accomplish it." Odin tried to respond, but his voice came out in 9 different tones. A chord instead of a note, harmony instead of melody. Loki seemed to understand anyway, the way blood brothers do. "No, don't thank me, don't apologize. Don't..." Loki's grin faltered for just a moment. "Don't tell me what you're seeing. Not yet. Let me have a few minutes of not knowing before the horror sets in." He walked around the tree, studying the wound from different angles. The spear still connected them. Odin pinned to 9 realities, Loki born from the space between. When Loki touched Gungnir's shaft, Odin felt it in all 9 realms simultaneously. A strange double sensation of being touched and doing the touching. "Blood brothers," Loki repeated, tasting the words. "Bound by murder and birth and sacrifice all mixed together. You know what that makes us?" He leaned close enough that Odin could see his own fading reflection in Loki's 2 bright eyes. "Complicit. Whatever you saw, whatever made you scared enough to rip yourself in half, I'm part of that now." The trick binds both sides of the equation. Loki pressed his palm against the tree's bark, against the sap still flowing from where he'd emerged. His expression shifted, the laughter draining away as he made contact with Yggdrasil's awareness. Through the wound web, Odin felt Loki accessing the same information, seeing through the same compound eyes. "Oh," Loki whispered, "just that." Oh, the color that had been so vibrant moments before dimmed slightly. Not draining away, Loki would keep what he'd taken, but settling, sobering, losing its pure joy as context flooded in. "So that's why," Loki said quietly. He looked up at his hanging brother with new understanding. "That's why you needed me separate. You can't be king and jester, father, and fool wisdom and chaos. Not anymore, not after..." He trailed off, still touching the tree, still reading what the sap carried. "I'll play my part," Loki said finally. "Be the chaos that makes your order look reasonable. The fool that makes you seem wise, the shadow your light casts." His smile returned, but it was different now. Sharper, sadder, knowing. "But don't expect me to like it. Don't expect me to forgive you for binding me to this knowledge before I was a day old." He stepped back from the tree, breaking contact. 9 days and 9 nights, the prophecy says. You're on day 5. 4 more to hang, brother. 4 more days to finish becoming whatever you're becoming while I figure out what I am. Loki looked toward the horizon, toward all 9 horizons simultaneously. "I think I'll go see what these worlds look like through eyes that aren't yours. While I still find anything funny." He walked away whistling, and the tune was one Odin had once known but could no longer remember how to carry. The vision passed the 9. On the 8th night, the barriers fell. Odin had thought he understood the tree, thought 9 days of hanging had taught him its secrets. But consciousness, stretched thin across 9 realities and scraped raw by deprivation, has a peculiar property. It starts seeing through things instead of at them. Through the wound web, through the blood sap connection, through the spaces between his 9 selves, Odin perceived what the tree had been protecting him from. Yggdrasil wasn't just a world tree, it was a ward. The 9 realms existed inside its structure, like rooms in a house, separate but connected, each with its own rules and residents. Odin had always assumed the tree organized reality, gave it structure, held the cosmos together. He'd had it backwards. The tree was a shell, a barrier, a membrane between inside and outside. The 9 realms weren't the whole of existence. They were a pocket, a bubble, a temporary shelter built from a dead god's spine to keep something out. Or several somethings. Odin's compound vision, 9 perspectives collapsed into one terrible panorama, could suddenly see past the bark. Beyond the roots that drank from wells of memory and fate, past the branches that scraped the ceilings of divine halls. In the space outside Yggdrasil, things waited. They weren't creatures, weren't gods or giants or any category he had language for. They were wrongness given form, existence inverted, the anti-pattern that preceded patterns, where the 9 realms operated on cause and effect, on time flowing forward and energy seeking equilibrium. These things existed in violation of those principles. They didn't hate the 9 realms. Hate required caring. They simply negated them, the way darkness doesn't hate light but occupies the space where light isn't. And they were patient, staggeringly, cosmically patient. They'd been pressed against Yggdrasil's outer bark since before the tree was a tree, when it was just Ymir's corpse growing green. They tested the barriers constantly, gentle, persistent pressure, looking for weaknesses, waiting for the ward to fail. Because all wards fail eventually. All shelters collapse, all bubbles pop. Through his expanded awareness, Odin saw the timeline. Not fate. Fate operated inside the 9 realms. This was something more absolute. Mathematical certainty. The tree was mortal the way gods were mortal, which meant immortal by human standards but temporary on cosmic scales. Yggdrasil would fall. The 9 realms would dissolve. The things outside would finally have access to the pocket of organized existence that had been denied them since creation. This was what lay beyond Ragnarök. Not renewal, not another cycle, not the optimistic Norse cosmology of worlds ending and beginning again. Just silence, and the patient things finally getting their turn. Odin saw the whole arc of it, saw Ragnarök approaching like a wave, saw himself and all the gods fighting their prophesied battles, saw the heroic last stands and noble deaths, saw the world tree burning, Surtur's flame consuming it from inside, while something outside pressed harder against the bark, saw the bubble pop, saw existence itself peel away like wet paper. And in that vision, hanging from 9 perspectives at once, bleeding both literally and metaphorically, Odin understood that all his cleverness meant nothing. The trick that had split him, the wisdom he was earning through agony, the runes that were even now beginning to glow in the bark below him, none of it could stop what was coming. But it could buy time. He couldn't prevent Ragnarök, but he could choreograph it, control the conditions, delay the moment when the wave hit. The things outside didn't experience time the way things inside did. For them, waiting 10,000 years or 10 million was the same patient pressure. But for the beings inside the bubble, every year mattered, every generation. Every moment of poetry and battle and love and spite and laughter and grief that happened before the end. Odin saw it all, and the weight of it crushed something in him that would never recover. 9 versions of himself, accepting the same terrible responsibility. 9 souls breaking under identical knowledge. The runes began to rise from below, and on the 9th dawn, the noose loosened and Odin fell. 9 of him fell through 9 different gravities, hitting 9 different grounds with impacts that ranged from the crack of breaking bone to the soft crush of moss to the splash of primordial ice water. His body should have shattered. Perhaps they did and reformed, or perhaps the threshold he'd crossed had left him temporarily unkillable. Either way, he stood. 9 versions rising simultaneously, each moving with the stiff awkwardness of something that had forgotten how joints worked. The spear came free, pulled itself out or was pushed out. The distinction no longer mattered. Gungnir gleamed clean despite 9 days buried in divine flesh, and when Odin's hands closed around it, he felt all 9 versions gripping the same shaft. The wound web remained even after the wound closed. He would always be 9-fold now, always seeing from every angle, never again knowing the mercy of singular perspective. His hair hung white against shoulders that seemed diminished, as if he'd lost mass along with color. When he touched his face, the features felt rearranged, not changed dramatically, but subtly wrong, like a portrait painted from memory by someone who'd known him once, but no longer quite remembered. The eye would come later. That would be another price, another trade. But for now, he still had both, though the left one saw things the right one couldn't, and vice versa, and reconciling the 2 views made his head ache with a pain that transcended the physical. In Asgard, the other gods waited. They'd seen him climb the tree, watched him drive the spear home, observed the 9 days of hanging with a mixture of horror and reverence. Now they watched him descend, this pale stranger wearing their king's face, and something in them understood that the hierarchy had shifted. Odin walked past them without speaking. What could he say? How could he explain what he'd seen with words that operated inside the bubble, in the shelter, in the temporary sanctuary that thought itself eternal? In Midgard, humans would later build temples. In Jotunheim, giants would grudgingly bow. In the other realms, the story would spread, how the Wanderer had become the All-Father, how the hanged god had brought wisdom through suffering. They would get it wrong, of course, would frame it as triumph rather than tragedy, would think he'd won something rather than simply learned the true score. Only Loki understood, and Loki was already gone, testing his new existence in distant corners of the 9 realms, laughing at things that weren't funny because the alternative was screaming. Odin found his hall, all 9 versions of it simultaneously, sat in his high seat, looked out over the realms he now saw with terrifying clarity. The thing about cosmic horror isn't the monsters, it's the math. The cold calculation that no amount of courage or cleverness can change. Odin had hung himself from a tree and torn himself into pieces to learn what the ending looked like. And the ending looked like ending. But not yet, not today. He had work to do. Fenrir to bind, knowing the binding guaranteed the wolf would devour him. Warriors to gather, knowing they'd fall in the final battle. Alliances to forge, knowing they'd shatter when tested. A whole elaborate machinery of delay to construct, postponing the moment when the bubble popped and the patient things outside finally got what they'd been waiting for. Some would call it futile, Odin called it necessary. Because the beings inside the bubble, the humans and elves and dwarves and even the gods themselves, deserved their moment. Deserved to love and fight and build and destroy and live fully in the temporary shelter that thought itself permanent. Even if that moment ended, even if the shelter fell, even if everything they built would someday be less than dust. Especially then. Odin sat in his high seat, white-haired and terrible and changed, and began making plans for a battle he knew he'd lose, to protect a world that couldn't be saved, to buy time for people who would never know how precarious their existence really was. The Trickster had hung himself from a tree and stopped laughing. The All-Father had taken his place. And beyond the bark of Yggdrasil, in the space outside the 9 realms, the patient things continued their gentle, persistent pressure, waiting.
Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe for more. Share to help the channel grow.